Jim and Terry Show coming to you from the Hobbit Hole Studio in downtown Bobcaygeon. Bright and sunny today, but nipply. Ooh, it's a cold one, minus 12 where I am. Yeah, just putting out the trash in the pre-dawn dust, the not yet light, the peaking of the sun over the horizon. It's still twilight. Twilight, one of my daughter's favorite shows when she was a teenager. Did anybody else's daughters get infatuated with Twilight, the series? Anybody read the books? I didn't, but I followed my daughter's interest in Twilight. But that has nothing to do with taking out the trash without any sunlight and fumbling your way, dragging bins to the curb and hoping for the best, hoping you don't stumble over something, slip on the icy patch. That was, how did I get on that? I don't know, but, let's talk about things that are uncertain. Uncertain grounds. Or maybe we should call this ground news. I'm just going to play a snippet of something, and I will talk about it afterwards. Here we go.
Kindly sponsored by Ground News.
Even atheists today are admitting that the universe, space-time and matter, had a beginning out of nothing.
Space-time and matter had a beginning out of nothing.
Part of the value of the ontological argument is to invite people to consider a more enchanting metaphysic.
Many of them were saying we need a new theory of evolution.
The language of a legal transaction is being utilized.
It just passes the buck to the next thing.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It is true. You can show it to be fact.
Did the conquest of Canaan actually happen?
The evidence overwhelmingly supports historical conquest.
Does it now? I've been studying the art of defending religious beliefs, commonly known as apologetics, for quite some time now, and over the years, I've noticed something fascinating. As I've watched prominent defenders navigate complex arguments, utilizing philosophy, archaeology, and science, patterns began to emerge. What started as casual observations gradually crystallized into something more defined, a recipe, if you will, for becoming a successful apologist. That is, someone who can effectively keep the religious steadfast in their faith and fend off the growing doubts posed by skepticism. What really struck me is that despite appearances, it's not really about their arguments or the depth of their knowledge. There's something else, something more fundamental in how they operate, how they position themselves, and how they handle challenges to their views. So I started noting down this recipe, and what blew my mind is that every major defender of the faith, without exception, follows this exact blueprint. And what I've come to realize is that this isn't a mere coincidence. They're not merely helpful attributes that they all happen to share. No, these are prerequisites. They are required. They are the essential ingredients for success as an apologist. Whether the defender be a Presbyterian championing the ontological argument.
Part of the value of the ontological argument is to invite people to consider a more enchanting metaphysic.
An evangelical defending young earth creationism.
It is true. You can show it to be fact. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Is a fact of history.
A Muslim defending the contingency argument.
It just passes the buck to the next thing.
Or, frankly, any Christian apologist insisting the Bible doesn't endorse slavery. It's all the same.
What is happening is that the language of a legal transaction is being utilized.
Legal transaction?
It's the exact same recipe. And the flock, oh boy, they love it. They eat it up. They come for seconds.
Yummy!
So today, what I'm going to do is pull back the curtain and show you in real time how a rising apologist is cooking with this recipe.
Well, that is an excerpt from a podcast called Rationality Rules, featuring a fellow whose name is Stephen Woodford. You can follow it on YouTube, Rationality Rules. I'll put a link in the description. Now, whether you believe him or not, there are patterns to be seen. Humans are ones who detect patterns easily, whether that's patterns in numbers, and that led to the branch of, well, I call it a pseudoscience, but it's a passion for some people, of numerology, the significance of numbers, sequences of numbers. That, of course, led me back in the 80s to look at writers who were looking at patterns in the Bible and looked for the Bible code, the God code, the things that were, you could find out the future. It's predicted. It's encoded in Hebrew in the Old Testament. It's encoded in Greek in the New Testament. It's encoded, baked in. So how did people know about that? Scan the digits, alphabetize, numericize. Is that a word? Assign a number value to all the letters and scramble it all up and have your supercomputer charge through the volumes of text and look for names. Could you find Satan and Obama together in the Old Testament? Could you find Trump in the New Testament? Could you find, well, the answer is you can find whatever you're looking for. So it's in a sort of a branch of affirmation or confirmation bias where you go looking for something and you're sure to find it. I remember the first gray hair. Yes, Jim and I are old, long in the tooth at this point. And if you look at dogs, especially black labs, they're gray muzzles as they age. That's sort of at my age and stage. But the first one was a bit of a shocker. And of course, you lost count eventually. What does that got to do with numerology and age? I'm not sure. Just a little anecdote for you. Rationality rules talks about patterns. And the patterns are for apologists specifically. And I used to consider myself 40 years ago to be an apologist. Maybe I peaked somewhere in the 80s, maybe in the 90s, so 30 to 40 years ago. But things have changed considerably in my worldview and my journey in life. I'm more of a skeptic, definitely a humanist, probably more of an agnostic with uncertainty imbuing everything that I look at and examine. Convinced of little, certain of little, but questioning everything and wondering in the end, what's it all about, Alfie? So here am I looking at apologists from the view of the other side of the aisle, having been there, seen it, done it, got the t-shirt, wrote the book, blah, blah, blah. Here I am looking at it from the outside. And is there a pattern? Having watched this whole episode, I am in agreement with much of what Woodford says in this podcast. There is a pattern. And a lot of it has to do with assigning value or credibility to people who are writing and saying things that really are not necessarily true. And that becomes troublesome for me. For instance, there is an apologist, a rising star on the apology sphere in the evangelical community. And he has a podcast, a website called Inspiring Philosophy. And you can follow him. I think his first name is Mike. His last name escapes me. But he's a rising star because he follows a couple of simple things. Number one, he comes across as certain. That means he makes all kinds of claims about things. But the lack of evidence or the misrepresenting of the evidence is a bit of a bother. You can talk loud, you can talk fast, you can be convincing like a car salesman, and Jim has a great way of doing this kind of presentation where you can talk your ear off and convince you of anything. But when you pull back the curtain on the speech and you look at the words and the patterns, there can be a problem.
Each apologist will, of course, trespass on the complexities of whatever topics are relevant to the argument they're defending. In this case, Michael is going to be speaking about the conquest of Canaan, the biblical narrative describing the Israelites' invasion and occupation of Canaan as commanded by God.
Give a summary of the scholarship on this in terms of, did the conquest of Canaan actually happen? What is the overall state of scholarship on a question like that?
Well, it seems to be shifting more in the direction of historicity. It definitely seems to be moving away from the old Deaver or Finkelstein idea that this was all mythology written later. Now, that still seems to be the consensus, especially among critical scholars for sure. But the evidence overwhelmingly supports an historical conquest.
What? Okay. I'm going to interject here and just say that is, well, it might even sound like bafflegab. I'm not sure that he understands what he just said, but it is a bit of a whiplash. It is what you're telling us at the start, that there is a shift towards historicity regarding the conquest narrative in the Old Testament. And at the end, he says the consensus of scholarship is not that. It's not that it was a historical event. And so you got these two things, two claims. You can't talk out of both sides of your mouth at the same time. It's either historicity, historical, or it is not. And the consensus is, of current scholarship, that it is not. So to say anything other than that is to set yourself up for a bit of a takedown? Who's going to take you down? Well, somebody who knows something. Perhaps an Assyriologist, perhaps an Egyptologist, perhaps someone who's familiar with languages and the ancient narrative, somebody who's familiar with the archaeology of the region. But this fellow from Inspiring Philosophy, though he means well and sounds good, sounds authoritative, and he's very convincing to the unschooled, the unlearned, the people who are sitting in the pews waiting to be illuminated by some divine spark of inspiration. It's good to know that there are people like Inspiring Philosophy who will defend the faith. Isn't that the good thing? Yeah, it is if you're sitting in the pew and you're a believer. If you're an agnostic or a skeptic, it's very much the same old story. And you make claims without evidence. And when evidence does appear, you try to shape it into funny shapes to fit your own preconceived ideas, meaning the Bible tells me so, therefore what I find in the stones and in archaeology, in the languages, in the ancient text is affirming. Or is it? Yeah, it's tough to be an apologist these days. The consensus is anything but affirming the Bible tells me so. The Jim and Terry Show, catching a few thorny issues before my friend joins me in the hot seat. Jim and Terry Show, signing off. For now, stay tuned, more to come.